I've been hiking for years. Almost every morning when the weather allowed it, I'd head out before sunrise and follow the same familiar trail through the woods. It was a routine I had grown to love. There was something comforting about moving through the quiet forest when the world was still waking up. The air was cool, sometimes even cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the soft rustling of trees swaying in the wind. It was peaceful. It was simple. It was mine. The trail I usually walked wasn't very difficult. It ran through a forest that sat on the edge of town, just a short drive from my house. It wasn't the kind of place that drew tourists or backpackers. It was mostly locals who walked it, people like me who wanted some fresh air before work. The path looped around a big rocky cliff that overlooked a wide field on the other side. There were streams that crossed it, little muddy patches where deer tracks were easy to find, and a few steep banks that required a little careful footing but nothing dangerous. I had been on that trail so many times that I could almost walk it with my eyes closed. I knew every bend, every fallen log, every old tree stump along the way. I always started at the small gravel parking lot and worked my way up the gentle incline through the tall pines until I reached the loop around the cliff. It was just under 5 miles round trip, and I usually took my time with it. I wasn't out there for exercise or to race through it. I just liked being outside, moving at my own pace. That particular morning started like any other. It was early spring, and the ground was still soft and damp from all the rain we'd had in March. I remember it was still chilly enough that I could see my breath in the air when I first stepped out of my car. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a dull gray light over everything. Birds were starting to wake up, their songs carrying softly through the trees. I zipped up my jacket, tightened my laces, and headed down the trail like I had done 100 times before. The first stretch of the trail was quiet and calm, just as I expected. The path was a little muddy in places, but I had good boots on, so it didn't bother me. I was about a mile in when I noticed something strange. There was a dark red patch in the middle of the trail. I stopped in my tracks and looked down at it. It was blood. I could tell right away. It wasn't just a few drops either. It was a small pool, maybe the size of my hand, soaked into the dirt and gravel. The edges of it were still shiny and wet, like it hadn't been there very long. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had seen blood on the trail before. Sometimes an animal gets caught by a predator, or maybe a deer gets injured. Nature is messy, and this was a wild place. I figured maybe a coyote had taken something overnight and dragged it across the path. But as I kept walking, I saw more of it. Not just another spot here or there, but a clear trail of blood. It wasn't one big smear. It was like a dotted line, splashes and drops leading down the trail. The more I followed it, the more there was. It was fresh. The color was still bright, and none of it had dried yet. I started to get a strange feeling in my stomach. I can't really explain it. Something about seeing that much blood and not knowing what was ahead of me made me nervous. I kept walking, but my steps slowed. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, listening for anything that didn't sound right. I've seen enough animal signs to know that whatever was bleeding had come this way not long before I did. The trail curved to the left, and the blood trail left the path and went up a steep bank on the side of the cliff. The incline was rough, full of loose rocks and tangled roots, but the blood kept going straight up. I stopped and looked up the slope. I couldn't see the top from where I stood, but I could hear something up there. It wasn't loud, but I could hear it. A soft, wet sound. A kind of low grunting, maybe mixed with something else. It was hard to tell exactly what I was hearing. For a second, I thought maybe I was walking into a predator's kill site. The blood, the sounds, it made me think maybe a bear or a mountain lion was up there feeding. My heart was beating faster now. I didn't know whether to turn around or keep going. I knew I probably shouldn't follow it, but something about it made me want to know what was going on. I didn't want to turn back and spend the rest of the day wondering. So I started climbing the bank, slowly, carefully, grabbing onto roots and rocks to steady myself. The ground was slick in places, and I had to move sideways sometimes to find good footing. As I got higher, the sounds became clearer. It wasn't a predator eating. It wasn't the ripping and crunching sounds I would have expected if something was tearing apart a carcass. It was something else. I reached a flat spot halfway up and finally saw what was making the noise. There was a doe standing just ahead of me, maybe 20 feet away. Her back was arched, her sides heaving with heavy breaths. Her fur was slick with sweat, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, her ears twitching. Behind her, on the ground, was a new fawn. It had just been born. The fawn was still wet, its legs trembling as it tried to stand. The blood trail I had been following led right to them. I froze in place. I didn't want to get any closer and risk scaring her. I just stood there, breathing quietly, watching the scene in front of me. I had never seen anything like that before. I had seen plenty of deer on my hikes, but I had never witnessed one giving birth. It was strange to see something like that in such a raw moment, out in the open, right there in front of me. The doe licked the fawn's fur, cleaning it, encouraging it to stand. The little thing kept wobbling, its legs bending awkwardly under its weight. I stood there for a couple minutes, maybe more, just watching. It felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I had stumbled into something private. After a while, I started to feel uncomfortable. Not scared exactly, but like I was intruding. It wasn't my place to be there watching her. She was probably stressed enough without me standing there. So I carefully backed away, making sure not to make any sudden moves, and climbed back down to the trail. My heart was still beating fast, but now it was from the excitement of what I had just seen. The rest of the hike was quiet. I kept thinking about the doe and the fawn, wondering if they would be okay. I didn't see any signs of predators around, but the woods are unpredictable. I hoped the mother would be able to lead her fawn to safety. I finished my hike and went home. I told myself I probably wouldn't see them again. The woods are big, and deer are always on the move. But a couple days later, that weekend, I went back to the same trail. I didn't go at sunrise this time. It was mid-morning, and the sun was high, lighting up the field that sat below the cliff where I had seen the birth. As I walked along the path, I kept glancing toward the field, not really expecting anything but still curious. That's when I saw them. The doe was standing at the edge of the field, near the tree line. The fawn was with her, a little steadier on its legs now, though still small and a bit wobbly. The mother was grazing, pulling at the grass, while the fawn stayed close by, mimicking her movements. I stopped walking and just watched them from a distance. They hadn't noticed me. I felt this strange wave of relief. I don't know why, but seeing that they had made it, at least for now, felt good. The woods can be brutal, and not every story out there has a good ending. But this one did. At least that's how I choose to remember it. I know the forest has its dangers, and maybe that fawn didn't make it past the next week or the next month. But I like to think it did. I like to think it got stronger, learned to run, learned to hide. That morning on the trail stuck with me more than I thought it would. I had gone out there expecting nothing more than a peaceful walk, but I ended up witnessing something rare and raw and beautiful. It's easy to forget how much life and death moves through those woods every day, just out of sight. That blood on the trail could have led to something terrible, but instead it led to a beginning, and that's something I'll never forget. I went hiking that weekend to get away from the noise. My life had gotten too loud. I needed silence, fresh air, and the steady rhythm of my own steps on dirt trails. I picked a remote area in the Pacific Northwest. Miles of trails, dense forest, and very little foot traffic. Exactly what I wanted. I planned a 3-day solo hike. I packed light but carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, map, compass, knife, bear spray. I had done this before. I wasn't an expert, but I knew what I was doing well enough to feel confident. The trailhead was empty when I parked. That was a good sign. The first day went smoothly. Cool air, soft ground, the occasional rustling of animals in the undergrowth. I made good time, set up camp by a small creek, and slept well under the thick canopy. Nothing unusual happened. I woke up early the next morning, packed up, and got back on the trail. By midday on the second day, the trail became less clear. It was still there, but it seemed like fewer people had walked it. The brush was thicker, the dirt less packed. I checked my map, made sure I was on the right path. I liked it better this way. Felt like I was really alone. I had read that the area had bears, maybe mountain lions, but the chances of seeing one were low. I made noise as I hiked, dragging my trekking pole across trees, clapping every now and then. It became a habit, a small sound every few minutes, just in case. It was late afternoon when I noticed something strange. About 20 feet off the trail, I saw a large rock face, and on it long, deep scratches. They were fresh. The lighter stone beneath the moss was clearly visible. I stopped and stared at them for a while. They were high, maybe 6 feet up. Definitely not a person. A bear, probably. I wasn't too worried. Bears scratch trees and rocks. It was normal. I kept moving. A few minutes later, I saw another tree with deep scratches. This time they were lower, but they looked recent too. The bark was still moist where it had been torn. I tapped my bear spray, making sure it was easily accessible. I kept hiking, but now I was more alert. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I realized I hadn't heard birds in a while. The wind barely moved the leaves. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept walking, kept making noise. As I moved, I noticed more trees with scratch marks. Some were higher, some lower, but they all looked fresh. They weren't following the trail exactly, but they seemed to be in the general direction I was going. I stopped to check my map again. The trail looped around a small hill and continued north. I was maybe 6 miles from where I planned to camp that night. I thought about turning back, but I didn't feel like I was in real danger yet. I decided to keep going, but I picked up my pace. The trail started climbing, winding around the hill. The higher I got, the more scratch marks I saw. Some on trees, some on rocks. And then I saw it. A huge pile of droppings, still steaming. I'd seen bear scat before, but this was bigger. It was also filled with hair and bones. I felt my stomach drop. I moved carefully now, my breathing shallow, my ears straining. I didn't see anything ahead. No movement, no sounds. I kept going. I rounded a bend, and the trail opened into a small clearing. There, in the center, was the carcass of a deer, fresh. His belly had been torn open, ribs cracked. Flies buzzed around it, but the blood was still bright red. I stopped cold. I looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the bushes. Nothing, but I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't know if the animal was still here or if it had just left, but it wasn't far. I slowly backed away from the clearing, careful not to turn my back on it. When I was back on the trail, I picked up my pace, walking fast but not running. I kept checking behind me, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The woods were still silent. I walked for another hour before I stopped to rest. I ate a little, drank water, but I couldn't relax. I decided to keep moving. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that carcass. The trail descended into a thick section of forest, the trees packed tightly together. The sunlight barely reached the ground. It felt claustrophobic. I kept hearing soft crunching sounds behind me, but when I stopped, they stopped too. I told myself it was just my nerves, just the forest settling. Then I heard something heavier, a branch snapping. I turned quickly, heart pounding, but saw nothing. I forced myself to keep moving. I heard it again, another branch, then a thud. Something was following me. I started to walk faster, pushing hard, my legs burning. I thought about running, but knew that was the worst thing I could do. Whatever it was big, and if I ran, it would chase me. I kept moving, trying to stay calm. The sounds behind me got closer. I could hear breathing now. Deep, steady breathing. Too big to be a person. Too steady to be a scared animal. I came around a bend and saw another scratch-marked tree. This one stripped of most of its bark. There were chunks of hair stuck in the sap. Long, coarse, dark hair. My legs pushed harder. I felt trapped. The trail seemed endless. Then the trail opened up a little, and I saw something to my right. Through the trees, maybe 20 feet away, it was moving. Huge, dark, steady. It wasn't afraid of me. It wasn't trying to hide. I only caught a glimpse, but it was enough. Its shoulders were massive, its body thick and heavy. It didn't move like a bear. It moved slowly, like it had all the time in the world. I kept moving, not daring to stop. I realized something then: whatever this thing was, it wasn't smart. It didn't need to be. It was too big to die. That thought stuck in my head. It didn't have to be clever, didn't have to stalk or ambush like a mountain lion. It just followed. It didn't care. Nothing could stop it. I pushed myself to keep moving, my muscles aching. I checked the map again. If I kept this pace, I could make it to a ranger station marked another 7 miles ahead. I hadn't planned to go that far today, but I had no choice. For the next few hours, it was the same. I moved quickly, the thing stayed with me. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of it through the trees. Sometimes I only heard it. It didn't rush. It didn't hide. It just followed. Night fell, and I kept moving with my headlamp on. I was exhausted, stumbling, couldn't stop. I knew that if I stopped, it would get closer. I hadn't eaten much, hadn't really drunk enough, but I didn't care. I just had to reach the station. At some point, I realized I wasn't hearing it anymore. No branches breaking, no heavy breathing. I didn't know if that was good or bad. Maybe it had lost interest. Maybe it had changed tactics. Maybe it was ahead of me now. I didn't know. I kept moving, using the map and my compass to stay on course. Every noise in the woods made me flinch. I imagined it stepping out of the shadows in front of me, blocking the trail. I imagined those huge shoulders, that slow, steady walk. Hours later, I finally saw it. A small, wooden ranger station, dark but solid. I stumbled toward it, desperate. The door was unlocked. I went inside, locked it behind me, and collapsed on the floor. I sat there in the dark, trying to hear if it had followed me all the way. But I heard nothing. Eventually, I found a dusty radio on the desk. It didn't work. The power was out. But I found some old emergency supplies. Water, crackers, a moldy blanket. I stayed there until morning. I didn't sleep. I just sat and listened. When the sun came up, I carefully stepped outside. Nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. It was as if it had never been there. But I knew it had. I'd seen it. I'd heard it. I'd felt it following me for miles. I made my way back to the trailhead that day. I didn't hear or see anything else. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I drove straight home. I didn't tell anyone. I don't know what it was. Maybe a bear, maybe something else. But I remember the way it moved. Slow, heavy, like it didn't need to hurry, like it didn't need to hide, like nothing could kill it. I still go hiking, but not alone anymore. And not in places like that. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, I think about it again. That steady sound behind me, that feeling that something was there. I'll always remember the thought that got stuck in my head. You don't have to be smart when you're too big to die. I went hiking to find silence. I didn't know I would find something that almost no one alive has seen. Started with a trip I had planned for months. I wanted to hike deep into a remote forest area in the northern Rockies. I'd looked at satellite maps, studied topographical charts, and found a trail that went deep into a region with almost no man-made paths. The kind of place most people wouldn't bother with. That's why I picked it. I packed for 5 days alone. Tent, stove, food, extra water filters, GPS, compass, 2 maps, and the usual safety gear. I wanted to disappear for a while. I wanted to walk until I stopped hearing airplanes overhead, until the only sounds were wind and birds. The first day was long but peaceful. I saw signs of elk, deer, the occasional bear track, but nothing alarming. The trail was marked for the first few miles, then it broke off into older, overgrown paths that most people probably hadn't walked in years. The second day I got deeper. The ground was soft and damp. I crossed small creeks and pushed through thick brush. I started to see things that told me people hadn't been here in a long time. Fallen trees across the path, no boot prints. Even the animals seemed less cautious, like they didn't expect people to pass through. That's when I saw the first footprint. It was huge, bigger than any bear track I'd seen. At first, I thought maybe it had been stretched by water or mud, but the shape was wrong for a bear. It wasn't a paw. It looked more like a hoof, but the size was ridiculous. I stood there staring at it, feeling the scale of it. It was sunk deep into the soft earth, and the step behind it was just as deep. I found 4 more in a row, leading off into the thicker trees. I'd heard stories of bison wandering these parts, though rare. Maybe it was a bison, but it felt wrong. It was too big. I kept moving. I set up camp that night near a small pond. I sat by the water eating my freeze-dried meal, listening to the frogs and insects. It was peaceful again, but I kept thinking about the tracks. On the 3rd day, I started seeing more signs. Trees were snapped, not just fallen. Snapped off at 7 or 8 feet high. Not small saplings either, but thick, young trees broken like twigs. I checked carefully. No saw marks.
No vern.
Just raw, twisted wood where they had been sheared off. I walked slower that day, more cautious. I found more of the strange tracks, always going the same direction. Always deep, always spaced far apart. Whatever it was, it covered ground quickly. Later that afternoon, I found a patch of disturbed soil. A wide area had been torn up, like something had rolled or thrashed there. In the center, I found old bones. Not arranged like a kill site, but scattered and trampled. Some of the bones were cracked, some ground into the dirt. I picked one up. It was thick, long, too big for deer, too dense for elk. Maybe moose, maybe something else. I kept going. I passed through a narrow valley between 2 ridges. The brush was thick, the trail almost invisible now. It felt like no one had walked here in decades. I stopped when I heard movement ahead. Deep, heavy footfalls. Not the quick, light steps of a deer. Slow, spaced, heavy enough to shake the ground just slightly under my boots. I crouched and listened. The steps were steady. I couldn't see what made them, but I could feel how big it was. I waited until the sounds moved away, then carefully followed at a distance. I saw it eventually, through the trees maybe 60 yards away. It looked like a bison at first glance, but it wasn't. It was something else. Taller, bulkier, with a thick, sloped back and a huge head that swayed as it moved. His horns were enormous, curved and wide. His coat was shaggy, matted in places. I knew, deep in my gut, that this was something ancient, something that wasn't supposed to still exist. It was an aurochs, or something like one, the ancestor of modern cattle. I'd seen pictures of the skeletons in museums, but the real thing was beyond imagining. It dwarfed modern cows and even bison. It was moving slow, but with the kind of power that made me realize nothing out here could threaten it. I followed it carefully, keeping my distance. It grazed on thick grass, tore bark from trees with its horns. It moved through the forest like the trees barely mattered. When it passed between 2 trunks, they bowed and creaked like twigs. I lost sight of it eventually, but I kept following the tracks. I should have turned back. I knew I was going too far, but I couldn't stop. I had to know more. The 4th day, I climbed higher ground to get a better view. I saw more of them, at least 4. Massive shapes moving slowly across an open meadow. 2 of them locked horns and shoved against each other. The sound of their skulls slamming together echoed through the valley like gunshots. Birds scattered from the trees. The ground shook with each impact. I watched for what felt like hours. I realized something else. They weren't alone. I saw other shapes, smaller but still massive. Something that looked like a giant deer but with thicker legs, a heavier body. Took me a long time to understand. It was something like a cervalsis, an ancient moose-like animal, with a deep chest and a wide rack of antlers. The size was hard to believe. It would have towered over modern moose. I realized I was looking at something I had only read about in books, animals from the Pleistocene era. Survivors. They weren't gone. They had just retreated so deep that we forgot about them. The scale of them was hard to grasp. Pictures in books don't prepare you. These weren't just big animals. They were the size of cars, some of them. The kind of size that makes you realize you would have no chance if they decided to charge. No chance to hide. No chance to fight. They weren't afraid of anything. They didn't need to be smart. They were too big to fear anything. I stayed hidden and watched as long as I could, taking in every detail. Their movements were slow but deliberate. They grazed, they fought, they moved as if the forest belonged to them, which it did. I wondered how many people had seen them over the years and dismissed them as misidentified bison or moose. I wondered how many stories of huge animals in remote forests had been laughed off because no one believed they could survive. Eventually, they moved on, deeper into the valley, into thicker forest. I marked the spot on my map but knew I wouldn't return. This wasn't something I wanted to disturb. I packed up the next morning and started hiking back. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting one of them to appear on the trail behind me, but I never saw them again. It took me 2 full days to get back to my car. When I reached it, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, thinking about what I had seen. I knew I couldn't prove it. I had no pictures, no bones, no samples. Just the memory of those towering animals moving through the forest like they had never left the age of giants. I never told anyone. I thought about writing it down, but I knew no one would believe me. People think they understand the world. They think all the big things are gone, that we've cataloged everything worth knowing. But they forget how big the world really is, how much of it we've never seen. Sometimes I still think about the size of those animals, about the sound of their footfalls, about the weight of their horns slamming together. They don't have to be clever. They don't have to hide. They are the last survivors of something ancient, and they are so much bigger than we understand. When people talk about bison or moose being dangerous, I think about those other things still out there, deep in the forests, moving slowly, not afraid of us, not even aware of us most of the time. Too big to fear anything. They don't need us to believe in them. They just keep walking, the last survivors of a time when everything was huge. I've always been drawn to winter hiking. Something about the cold, the quiet, the sharpness of it all. Trails that are crowded in the summer feel completely different in the winter months. The woods fall silent under the weight of the snow, and the mountains seem even more distant, almost untouchable. There's this peace you can find out there, but winter hikes also come with their own risks I sometimes ignored when I should have paid more attention. I've done a lot of hiking in bad weather, and I've told myself many times that I know my limits, but that's not always true. Some days you push when you shouldn't. Some days you convince yourself it's just a little wind, just a little snow, and that you can handle it. That's what happened that day. It was supposed to be just another winter summit, but I made a mistake. I underestimated the storm. I underestimated the mountain. I remember the day clearly. It was late winter, one of those days when the weather swings back and forth between calm and dangerous in a matter of hours. My friend and I had been planning the hike for a couple of weeks. We wanted to summit a peak that wasn't too well known, one of those mountains that doesn't show up on the most popular lists but still stands tall and rough, especially in the winter. We had tracked the weather all week. The report said there would be snow overnight, but we figured it would be manageable by morning. The winds were supposed to pick up in the afternoon, but we thought we'd be well off the ridge by then. We were wrong. When we started the climb, it was already snowing lightly. The trailhead was quiet, our cars the only ones in the lot. We loaded our packs, pulled on our winter layers, and set off. The snow wasn't too deep at the start. The first couple of miles went smoothly, but I could feel the wind already tugging at my jacket and pushing at my backpack. It wasn't steady yet, but it was there, waiting. As we gained elevation, the snow deepened. It wasn't fluffy powder. It was wet, heavy, clinging to our boots. Every step took more effort. By the time we reached the ridge, the snow was shin-deep in most places, sometimes deeper where the wind had piled it up. The ridge was long and narrow, and the wind was coming hard off the peak, straight down the ridge toward us. I could feel it pushing against me, cutting through the gaps in my jacket no matter how tight I cinched it. We had about 800 feet of elevation left to the summit, but those 800 feet felt like a long way in that storm. The sky was darkening faster than I expected. The clouds were thick, low, heavy with more snow. The sun, already hidden, was dropping behind the ridge line. The wind was gusting harder, loud enough that we had to walk with our heads down and our arms close to our sides to keep our balance. It wasn't until the wind lulled that the quiet hit me. It was like someone turned the volume off all of a sudden. For the first time since we hit the ridge, I could hear something other than the roaring wind. That's when I heard it. A scream. It came from somewhere up ahead, along the ridge closer to the summit. It wasn't just a loud noise. It was long, drawn out, sharp, and it didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like something natural. It sounded human. It was the kind of scream that stops you cold, that grips something deep in your chest and holds it. It wasn't the short burst of someone shouting across a distance. It was full, desperate, like someone in real pain or real fear. The wind picked back up a few seconds later, slamming into us again and swallowing up everything. It was so loud that I could barely hear my own boots crunching in the snow. The scream was gone, like it had been pulled away by the storm. I felt my skin go cold under my layers. I looked at my friend, and I could see in his face that he had heard it too. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. I could feel his hesitation, the same knot in my stomach tightening in him. We stood there in the blasting wind for a few seconds, bracing ourselves, trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to believe I had misheard it, that maybe the wind had twisted some sound into something it wasn't. But I knew what I heard. It was a scream. There was no question. We made the decision to turn back. The weather was getting worse by the minute, the light was almost gone, and now we had heard that scream coming from the direction we were heading. It didn't make sense to push forward. It didn't feel right. Turning around wasn't easy. Going down in snow that deep, in wind that strong, with the fading light, was slow and miserable. Every step we took back down the ridge was a fight. The wind blew straight into us now, shoving us off balance, forcing us to lean into it and plant our feet carefully with each step. There were a few times when I had to drop to a knee just to stay upright when a gust hit. The storm didn't let up. The snow stung as it hit my face, and the wind tore at my hood until it finally ripped the drawstrings loose. My face was raw, my gloves stiff with wet snow. As we descended, I kept thinking I could hear something else in the wind. It was faint, like a low pulsing sound that drifted in and out with the gusts. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it kept coming back. It sounded like a helicopter, that steady whump 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 of blades cutting through the air. But every time I stopped to listen, the wind would crash over me again and drown it out. The visibility was too low to see much of anything. Snow swirled around us, and even though I kept scanning the sky, I never saw any lights or shapes that looked like a helicopter. It followed us all the way back to the tent site. This sound in the wind, this steady thudding that would vanish as soon as I tried to focus on it. By the time we reached camp, I was exhausted. My legs were shaking from the effort. My face was numb, and my jacket was soaked through. We worked quickly to get inside the tent and seal ourselves off from the storm. The fabric flapped violently. The poles shuddered, but it held. Inside, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I kept thinking about that scream. I replayed it in my head over and over, trying to convince myself it was something else. A weird animal call, maybe, or some trick of the wind. But it hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded like a man falling. I drifted in and out of sleep that night, the wind constantly shaking the tent and the snow building up around us. Every now and then I would wake, still half hearing that distant thumping sound in the storm. The next morning, the wind had eased, but the snow was deep. We took our time breaking down camp, moving stiffly, our muscles sore and heavy from the fight down the ridge. When we got back to the trailhead, there were a few other cars parked there now. Some day hikers were getting ready to head out, but the storm had probably kept most people away. I was glad to be back, glad to step into the car, turn on the heater, and get warm. It wasn't until the next afternoon, back at home, when I saw the news report. One dead after falling from a ridge during a military exercise. Stopped me cold when I read it. I clicked on the article, my hands starting to sweat as I scrolled. The accident had happened the previous afternoon, during the same storm. Military personnel had been training on the summit ridge of the mountain we had been climbing. One man had fallen from the ridge in the poor weather conditions. He didn't survive. His body had been recovered by a helicopter later that evening, after the winds had finally died enough for a recovery team to move in. The article didn't say his name. It didn't give much detail, just that it happened during a training exercise during the storm on the summit ridge. The ridge we were climbing to, the ridge we had turned away from after hearing that scream. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, replaying everything. The snow, the wind, the fading light, the scream, the sound of helicopter blades I kept hearing but could never see. I realized I had heard that man fall. I had heard his final moment. The sound I heard wasn't something twisting in the wind. It wasn't a trick. It was real. He had been up there, not far from where we would have been if we had pushed ahead, and he had slipped or been thrown by the wind or lost his footing in the deep snow. I thought about what it would have been like to hear him fall and not know, to keep climbing and maybe come across something I never wanted to see. I thought about how close we had been to that ridge, how close we had been to being caught in the same storm that took him. I thought about how easy it is to miss those lines when you're out there, the lines between safe and dangerous, between stubborn and foolish. Winter mountains are beautiful. They're quiet. They make you feel like you're the only one there. But they don't care about you. They don't care how careful you think you are. They don't care about your plans. I'll never forget that scream. I'll never forget how it cut through the stillness, how it lingered in the cold air for those few seconds before the wind swallowed it again. And I'll never forget that we turned back, that we chose to walk away when it didn't feel right. It was late fall when my boyfriend, Jason, and I went for that hike. The leaves had mostly fallen by then, leaving bare trees with only a few stubborn yellow and brown ones still clinging to the branches. We were used to hiking this time of year, used to the quiet that came with it. The air was cool but not cold enough for snow yet, and there weren't many people out on the trails. It always felt a little lonelier in the park once the summer crowds disappeared, but I liked that part. The quiet made it peaceful. We hadn't planned anything big that day. It was just supposed to be a few miles to stretch our legs. We weren't far from home, maybe a 45-minute drive to the park entrance. We had hiked here plenty of times before, so we didn't bring much. No packs, no extra gear. Just water bottles, our phones, and a couple granola bars stuffed in our jacket pockets. I remember thinking when we started that we probably should have double-checked the time. It was around the end of October, maybe the first weekend in November. That's the time of year when daylight saving time either kicks in or ends. I can never remember which, but either way, the sun starts dropping sooner than you expect. It always sneaks up on you. We set out around mid-afternoon, thinking we had plenty of time to get out and back before sunset. We walked at a normal pace, taking in the gray skies and the cold wind rattling the branches overhead. It wasn't the most beautiful day, but it was fine enough for a quiet walk. I don't remember exactly how far we went in, maybe 3 miles, maybe 4. There was a point where Jason checked his phone and mentioned how quickly the sun seemed to be setting. We weren't panicked, but we both agreed to pick up the pace to make sure we got back before dark. It was one of those trails that looped around and eventually led back to the entrance parking lot.
No campsites, no shelters.
It wasn't a place where people stayed overnight. The park didn't even allow it. The trail wasn't wide, just enough room for 2 people side by side, surrounded by woods on either side. There were no steep cliffs or anything like that, just dirt, roots, patches of rocks, and fallen leaves crunching under our shoes. As we started moving faster, I noticed how the light seemed to drain from the trees a little quicker than I expected. The woods darken fast in the fall. Even if the sun's still up, the tall trees block it, especially with the hills rising around you. We weren't the only ones out there. I remember hearing a few distant voices earlier, but by that time the trail felt empty. Just me and Jason, moving quickly toward the park entrance. Then we heard him. At first, it was just the sound of someone's shoes brushing against the dirt and leaves behind us. It wasn't alarming. People pass each other on trails all the time. The sound grew louder as whoever it was got closer. We were already walking quickly, so whoever was behind us was moving at a pretty good clip. Jason and I both slowed down to let him pass. That's what you do on the trail. It's normal. It's polite. When the guy came up beside us, I immediately noticed something strange about him. He was wearing all black. Black hoodie pulled up over his head, black pants, black sneakers. His head was tilted down as he walked, his hands in his pockets. But what I remember most was the sound. He was whistling. It wasn't a particular tune, at least not one I recognized. It was just the steady, low, almost careless whistle that drifted out between his lips as he walked fast toward us. When we slowed to let him pass, Jason gave him a quick nod, and I gave him a small wave out of habit. We both said hello at the same time, but the guy didn't say a word. He just lifted his head slightly, looked directly at us for maybe half a second, no smile, no nod, no expression at all, and then kept walking right past us without slowing down. The whistling stopped when he looked at us, but it started up again as soon as he passed. The moment stuck with me because of that look. It wasn't angry, and it wasn't sad. It was just blank, empty. It was the kind of face you see when someone is thinking hard about something else and barely registers you as a person in front of them. I told myself not to overthink it. Some people just don't like talking. Some people are weird about trail etiquette. Not everyone wants to be friendly, but still, it sat wrong with me. Jason and I kept walking, though we slowed a little after that. We both glanced back a few times, watching the guy get smaller up ahead on the trail. The entrance to the park was to the north, where the trail looped back to the parking lot. But after another few minutes, we noticed the guy up ahead reach a fork in the trail. Without hesitating, he turned sharply to the left. That wasn't the direction to the entrance. That path led deeper into the woods, towards some of the older, less used trails. It was late, and it was getting dark, and the temperature was dropping quickly. Nobody in their right mind would keep going out that way, especially not at that pace and especially not dressed like that. No pack, no gear, just walking briskly into the woods alone. Jason and I stopped briefly and watched him go. I remember how quickly he disappeared into the trees. The whistle faded with him. It wasn't loud, but the sound carried in the cold air. It was like the whistle was the last part of him we could hear before the woods swallowed him up. We stood there for a few seconds. Jason looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. It didn't make sense. There was nothing out that way.
No campsites.
No cabins. No ranger stations. That trail eventually just looped back and crossed over a couple of creeks, but it didn't connect to anything else. It was a dead-end circuit that people barely used. I started to feel that uneasy crawling sensation in my gut. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like confusion laced with something sharper, something that made my stomach tighten a little. We picked up our pace again and didn't say much for the rest of the hike out. The sun was low enough that the woods were starting to feel heavy with shadow. I remember my ears stinging from the cold wind as it slipped down between the trees. When we finally made it to the parking lot, it was almost fully dark. Jason's car was one of only two left. The other was a beat-up black SUV, the kind with mismatched panels and some duct tape on one of the rear windows. I don't know if it was his car. I'll never know. But I remember locking eyes with that SUV as we got into our car and drove away. The headlights washed over it for a moment, and I half expected to see someone sitting in the driver's seat, but it was empty, at least as far as I could tell. The ride home was quiet. Jason turned on the heat, and we both stared out the windows as the trees blurred past. I couldn't shake that feeling, the lingering weirdness of the whole thing. A few nights later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the park trail maps and tried to trace where that left-hand fork went. I followed it with my finger on the screen and realized that if the man had kept walking that way, he would have either circled back on a small loop or had to retrace his steps. There wasn't much else to it. No logical destination. I didn't find any reports of missing persons in the park that week. Nothing about a man in black.
No arrests, no incidents.
It was like nothing ever happened. But the thing that stuck with me, what stuck with me ever since, is that the guy wasn't in a hurry to get out before dark like we were. He didn't seem worried about the time or the cold or the night creeping in. He was just there, walking fast, whistling, splitting off in a direction that didn't lead anywhere. It's possible he was just another hiker. Maybe he knew the area better than I did. Maybe he had a plan. But I'll never really know what he was doing out there, alone at dusk, heading deeper into a trail that nobody used. It wasn't the sort of story you tell as a big event. Nothing technically happened. Nobody jumped out from behind a tree. Nobody followed us back to the car. Nobody got hurt. But it's the story that still lingers in the back of my mind when I think about how quickly people can pass in and out of your life how sometimes you cross paths with people who leave you with nothing but a feeling. I've hiked a lot since then. I've had a lot of good trips, a lot of peaceful days in the woods, but I can still hear that whistle when I think about it too long. That low, tuneless sound cutting through the quiet. Sometimes the people you don't understand are the ones who stay with you the longest. And sometimes that's the scariest part. I've spent most of my weekends hiking. There's something about walking into the woods alone that always gave me peace. It was a way to get out of the noise, out of the routines, and just be away from everything. I never really hiked with people, not because I didn't have friends, but because I enjoyed the silence. The woods have their own sound, and it's something you can only really notice when you're by yourself. This happened a few years ago when I decided to explore a lesser-known trail up in the hills a few hours from where I lived. I'd seen the trail listed on a small hiking forum. The post mentioned it wasn't officially maintained anymore, but the route was still passable if you didn't mind pushing through some overgrowth and taking it slow in places. The pictures caught my attention. Old stone walls, parts of what seemed like an abandoned homestead, and dense pine forests where the sunlight barely touched the ground. That was exactly the kind of trail I liked, quiet, forgotten, and with a bit of history to it. I planned it for a cool autumn weekend, the kind where the mornings start cold, but by midday you're peeling off layers. I packed light since I was only going to do an out-and-back day hike, just water, some snacks, a basic first aid kit, and a printed map of the area since phone signal was going to be spotty or non-existent. The trailhead was just a dirt pull-off on the side of a narrow forest road. No signs, no markers, just a faint worn path disappearing into the trees. It didn't bother me. I'd done enough hiking off the beaten path to feel comfortable in those kinds of places. I parked my car, locked it, double-checked my pack, and started in. The trail was just as quiet as I'd hoped. The first hour or so was steady climbing through thick trees, with occasional breaks where I could see the valley spreading out behind me. The path was barely visible in some stretches, overgrown with ferns and tall grass, but someone had clearly used it not too long ago. The undergrowth was flattened in places like boots had passed through recently. I figured it was probably just another hiker who'd found the trail the same way I did. About 2 hours in, I came across the old stone walls I'd seen in the forum post. They were low, crumbling, half covered in moss, but still standing in places. It looked like they used to outline a property a long time ago. There was the faint shape of a foundation nearby, square and filled with weeds and small saplings. Maybe someone's house had stood there 100 years ago. I lingered for a while, taking slow steps around the ruins, noticing rusted pieces of metal buried in the ground, parts of an old stove maybe, or broken farm equipment. It fascinated me to imagine someone living out here so far from anything. Eventually, I moved on. The trail continued past the walls, winding deeper into the forest. I hadn't seen a single other person all day, and that was exactly what I wanted. It was sometime in the early afternoon when I came to a small clearing. There wasn't anything remarkable about it at first, just a dip in the land where the trees thinned out and the ground leveled for a bit. But as I crossed it, something caught my eye. It was a small metal tin. It sat right at the base of a tree, just barely noticeable under some dry leaves. The tin was about the size of a cookie tin, old but not rusted shut. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was because I hadn't expected to see anything man-made out there. It didn't seem like trash. It was placed too neatly, not tossed aside like someone had dropped it. Curiosity got the better of me. I set my pack down and crouched to look at it. The lid wasn't sealed tightly. I could pry it open with just my fingers. Inside, I found something I wasn't prepared for. There were several photographs neatly stacked. There were some folded papers, and underneath those, what looked like an old, thin rope, coiled loosely. The photos weren't scenic shots or family pictures. They were pictures of people, random people in parks, on sidewalks, sitting at bus stops. None of them looked posed. They seemed to be taken from a distance, like someone had been watching them without them knowing. Some of the photos had dates scribbled on the back, but no names. The papers were lists of places, street corners, parking lots, building addresses, with dates written next to them. Some of the places I recognized as being in the city where I lived, others I didn't know. The handwriting was sharp, rushed, but clear. The rope was unsettling. It was short, maybe 2 or 3 feet long, and tied at one end in a simple noose. There was nothing else. No name, no ID, no explanation. Just this tin sitting quietly in the woods. I sat there staring at it for a long time, the forest silent around me. I didn't know what I was supposed to think. At first, I wondered if it was some kind of strange game or an art project. Maybe someone left it there on purpose to see if anyone would find it. But the tone of it didn't feel like a joke. The photos weren't staged. They didn't have that look of something made for a scavenger hunt. They looked real. The people in them were going about their normal lives, walking, waiting, talking on phones, completely unaware they were being watched. A few of the lists had dates that had passed years ago. Some were more recent, just a few months back. One of the most recent dates was from 2 weeks before I'd found the tin. I remember feeling a deep discomfort settle into me, like I just brushed up against something that wasn't meant to be found. I considered taking the tin back with me. Part of me thought I should hand it over to the police, but another part of me didn't want to touch it any more than I already had. I wasn't sure what good it would do. There were no names, no direct threats written anywhere, just observations, patterns, and that length of rope. I spent another 15 minutes just sitting there, going over it again and again, like maybe I'd missed something that would make it all make sense. But it never did. Eventually, I carefully put everything back into the tin, closed it, and set it back down exactly where I'd found it. I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't want to carry it with me. Maybe I was afraid of what it would mean to take it. I zipped up my pack and stood up, looking around the clearing, suddenly aware of how alone I was out there. The trees were quiet. The breeze was soft. Nothing moved, but I felt watched, like whoever had left that tin could still be nearby. Maybe they'd seen me find it. Maybe they were watching to see what I would do. Maybe they'd abandoned it. Maybe they'd changed their mind about whatever they had been planning. I left the clearing and kept moving, putting more distance between me and that tin, checking over my shoulder more often now, listening harder to every snap of a twig or rush of wind through the branches. The hike back was longer than I remembered. I was in my own head the whole time, thinking about the people in those photos, wondering if they had ever known someone had been following them. The forest started to feel less peaceful and more like it was pressing in on me. When I finally got back to my car, I locked the doors quickly and sat there for a while, my heart still unsettled. I kept replaying it in my mind. Part of me thought I should have taken the tin, but another part of me was just glad to be out of there. When I got home, I looked up a few of the addresses I could remember from the lists. Some were just regular places: a grocery store, a public library, a downtown bus stop. Nothing that connected them, nothing that made them special. I never found anything in the news that tied those places to any incidents or crimes. Maybe I just didn't know what I was looking for. I never went back to that trail. I don't know if anyone else found the tin after me. Maybe it's still sitting there. Maybe whoever left it decided not to go through with whatever they were planning. Maybe they walked out there, left it behind, and walked away from it all. Maybe it was a final step for them, letting it go. I hope that's what happened. I really do, because the other possibility is harder to live with, that they simply moved on to something else, someone else, somewhere else, and the tin was just something they didn't need anymore. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see if it's still there, but I never do. Some things are better left where you found them. Some things you're not meant to carry with you, but I do in a way. I still see those photographs in my head. I still wonder if any of those people ever knew. I still remember the feel of that tin in my hands, cold and light, like it didn't weigh nearly enough for the kind of fear it carried. It's strange how something so small can stick to you like that. And even now, years later, I still check over my shoulder when I'm hiking alone. I still catch myself watching the edges of the trail, not just for animals or getting lost, but for other things, like a tin, like something left behind, something that was meant to be forgotten.